It had been 27 years since the day that changed everything. A school trip, meant to be an exciting adventure for a group of young students, had instead turned into one of the most baffling and heartbreaking mysteries the town had ever seen. An entire class, 15 children and their teacher, had vanished without a trace. At first, the authorities had scrambled to find answers. Search teams combed through miles of wilderness, helicopters hovered over forests and rivers, and volunteers plastered the town with missing posters. But as the days stretched into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the case went cold. There were no bodies, no evidence, no clear explanation. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Suspicion had initially fallen on the man who had led the trip, Mr. Gregory, their classroom teacher. He had disappeared with them, after all. Some believed he had orchestrated their abduction. Others theorized that an accident had occurred, and he had gone into hiding out of fear. But without any solid leads, the police had nothing to work with. The case, which had once dominated the news, was eventually pushed to the background, replaced by fresher tragedies. For the families of the missing children, the pain never faded. Some parents moved away, unable to bear the weight of the unknown. Others found solace in religion, in therapy, or simply in time. But there was one mother who refused to let go. Laura Calloway had lost her daughter, Rory, that day. A bright, spirited 11-year-old girl who had been excited for the trip, chattering endlessly about the sights they would see. Laura could still remember the last time she saw her, standing in front of the school bus, her hair tied up in a ponytail, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "I'll tell you everything when I get back," Rory had promised with a wide grin. But she never came back. For 27 years, Laura had lived in the shadow of her daughter's absence. She had spent countless nights wondering, pleading, praying for answers. Every September 28th, on the anniversary of the disappearance, she visited the cemetery where a headstone with Rory's name stood. An empty grave, a painful symbol of a life that had been stolen. Time had taken its toll on her. The grief had changed her, worn her down, left her with more questions than peace. But she never stopped searching. And then, one ordinary afternoon, something changed. She had been going through a box of old photographs, remnants of a past life, when her fingers brushed against one she had never seen before. It was a group picture from the school trip, showing the children in their uniforms, standing together in front of the bright yellow school bus. For a moment, Laura simply stared at it, her heart aching at the sight of Rory's smiling face. But then her eyes caught something, a detail she had never noticed before. Standing at the far left of the photo was Principal Lillian Brooks. Her breath caught in her throat. That wasn't right. The school had always claimed that only Mr. Gregory and one support staff member had gone on the trip. The principal had never been mentioned as part of the group. A chill ran down her spine. For 27 years, she had believed the story she had been told. That the teacher had taken her daughter and the others on that ill-fated trip. That no one knew what had happened after they drove away. But if Principal Brooks had been there too, why had she never spoken about it? Why had this detail been erased from every report, every interview, every official statement? Laura's hands trembled as she clutched the photograph, her mind racing with possibilities. Had the truth been right in front of her all along? Had they all been lied to? She needed answers, and she was going to find them no matter what it took. The morning of September 28, 2023, arrived with a gray, overcast sky, as if the world itself mourned alongside her. Laura Calloway lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the day pressed down on her chest. 27 years. It didn't seem possible that so much time had passed, and yet, in her heart, it still felt like yesterday. The grief never faded. It had changed shape, dulled at times, but on this day, it returned as sharp as ever, cutting through her like a blade. She turned her head to the nightstand, where a framed photograph rested beside her alarm clock. Rory's face beamed up at her, frozen in time. 11 years old, bright-eyed, full of life. Laura reached for the frame, tracing her daughter's image with the tip of her finger. "Oh, Rory," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She took a deep breath, willing herself to push through the sorrow that threatened to consume her. She had endured 27 years of this. She had learned to carry the pain, even when it felt unbearable. Today would be no different. Forcing herself to get out of bed, she moved through the motions of her morning routine. A splash of cold water to wake herself up, a brush through her graying hair, a simple sweater and jeans. She didn't need to dress up. There was no one to impress. This day was about remembrance, not appearances. As she checked her phone, she noticed a text from Helen Carter. "You're not alone in this. All of us still remember. If you need company, come over anytime. Helen." One of the few people in the world who truly understood her pain. Her daughter, Sally, had been in Rory's class, taken on that same terrible day. Over the years, their shared grief had bound them together in a way no one else could comprehend. Laura hesitated before typing back a response. "I'd love to come over. I'll bring some tea and cookies." Helen replied almost immediately, "I'll put the kettle on." Laura gathered a few packets of Earl Grey lavender tea and a jar of cookies from her kitchen. It felt small, almost insignificant, but arriving empty-handed didn't sit right with her, even after all these years of friendship. The short walk to Helen's house was quiet, the streets nearly empty. The town hadn't changed much in 27 years. The same houses, the same trees lining the sidewalks. It was a cruel contrast to how much her own life had been altered. By the time she reached Helen's front steps, the door was already opening. Helen stood there with a soft, understanding smile, her kind brown eyes filled with warmth. Without a word, she pulled Laura into a hug. "Come in," she said gently. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and tea. It was comforting, familiar. Laura set the cookies on the counter as Helen busied herself with the boiling water. They settled onto the living room sofa, their hands wrapped around warm cups. The aroma of lavender and bergamot filled the space between them, offering a brief, fragile sense of peace. Helen was the first to speak. "How are you holding up?" Laura exhaled slowly. "I'm trying," she admitted. "This day is always the hardest." Helen nodded, her expression filled with quiet empathy. "I know. It never really gets easier, does it?" Laura shook her head. "Even though I've learned to live with it, the past still haunts me. I wake up every morning knowing my daughter is gone. But today," her voice broke slightly, "today, it feels like I lost her all over again." Helen reached over, squeezing Laura's hand. "It's the same for me," she admitted. "I finished therapy last year, but days like today, they bring everything back. Some wounds just don't heal." The kettle whistled, and Helen poured them both another cup. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their tea, allowing themselves the space to grieve without words. After a few moments, Helen gave Laura a small smile. "I was thinking, maybe we could look through some old photos together." Laura hesitated. She had spent years avoiding those pictures, afraid of reopening old wounds. But today it felt right. She nodded. "I think that might be good." Helen stood and walked over to the cabinet, pulling out an old photo album. As she returned to the sofa, she placed it between them, her fingers resting lightly on the worn leather cover. They opened it together. The pages were filled with memories, birthday parties, school recitals, family picnics. Rory and Sally, side by side, their young faces full of laughter and life. Laura traced the edges of a picture with her fingertip. "Do you remember when they first started at that school?" she asked softly. Helen smiled wistfully. 5th grade. The school had only been open for 2 years at that point. There were barely a dozen students. "And by the end of that year, it had grown to 15, Laura murmured. "They worked so hard to get parents to enroll. All those discounted fees, all the marketing." Helen nodded. It felt like a good school, like a safe place. They turned the page, and Laura's breath caught in her throat. A photo she had never seen before. It showed Rory and Sally, along with some of their classmates, working on a science project. The children were laughing, their hands messy with glue and construction paper. "This picture," Laura whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "It's beautiful." Helen glanced over. "I got it from the police a few months ago. Since the case went cold, they allowed parents to collect copies of evidence materials. I requested everything they had." Laura blinked in surprise. "I didn't know we could do that." Helen gave her a sad smile. "Maybe it's better that you didn't. Having all this, it made it harder to move on. I spent so many sleepless nights going through these, looking for something, anything, that might explain what happened." As they continued flipping through the pages, Laura came across another unfamiliar image. Class picture. The children, their teacher, and her heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the far left, was Principal Lillian Brooks. A strange feeling settled in Laura's chest. She had been told, for years, that only Mr. Gregory and a support staff member had been on the trip. Then why was Principal Brooks in this picture? Her grip tightened around the album, a detail she had never noticed before, a detail that didn't fit. Helen noticed her expression. "Laura," she said cautiously, "what is it?" Laura hesitated. She had been down this road before, finding something that seemed like a clue, only for it to lead nowhere. But this felt different. She closed the album, pressing the photo against her palm. "I need to go," she said suddenly, rising from the couch. Helen looked up, concerned. "Laura, what's wrong?" Laura swallowed, her mind racing. I need to check something." And with that, she grabbed her coat and stepped out into the cold air, her pulse quickening with a feeling she hadn't had in years. For the first time in a long time, she had a lead, and she wasn't going to ignore it. Helen set down her teacup and reached for a stack of papers and photographs tucked inside a folder on the coffee table. She hesitated for a moment before flipping through them, then carefully pulled out a slightly worn photograph. The edges were creased, the colors slightly faded with time, but the image itself was clear. "I got this from the police a few months ago," she said, handing it to Laura. "They finally allowed parents to collect evidence materials after the case went cold. I don't think I ever showed this one to you." Laura took the picture gingerly, her fingers brushing over the glossy surface. It was a group photo, one she had never seen before. The class stood in front of a yellow school bus, lined up in neat rows, their teacher standing off to the side. The children wore their school uniforms, some with their shirts untucked, others with wide, excited smiles. They had no idea that this moment, captured just before they left for the trip, would be one of the last images ever taken of them. Her breath caught as she scanned the faces, and then a jolt of unease shot through her. There, standing at the far left, was Principal Lillian Brooks. Laura's grip tightened around the edges of the photograph. Something didn't make sense. She had spent years poring over news articles, attending every meeting with the police, sitting through hours of interrogations and court hearings when the case was still fresh. The official story had always been clear. Only Mr. Gregory and a support staff member had accompanied the students that day. Then why was the principal in this picture? Why is Lillian Brooks here? Laura murmured, barely hearing the words as they left her lips. Helen looked over at the photograph and sighed, rubbing her temples. "I remember there were rumors. Some parents thought the extra staff member was actually the principal, but I never gave it much thought. We were told over and over again that it was an administrative assistant who went." Laura shook her head, her heart hammering. "But I remember the reports. I sat through every meeting, every statement the school ever gave. If Lillian Brooks had been there that day, why wasn't that ever mentioned?" Helen exhaled slowly, setting her tea down on the table. "Laura," she said gently, "we've been through this before. We've gone over every detail 100 times, thinking we found something new, only to hit a dead end. But this didn't feel like a dead end. It felt like a missing puzzle piece suddenly snapping into place." Laura stared at the photo, her mind racing. If the principal had been present, then why had the school and the authorities hidden that fact? Was it a mistake, a simple omission lost in the chaos of a massive investigation? Or had they deliberately concealed it? She swallowed hard. What if everything they had believed for the past 27 years had been wrong? Helen reached over, placing a comforting hand on Laura's arm. "You're thinking about digging again, aren't you?" she said quietly. Laura clenched her jaw, still staring at the photograph. "I don't know," she admitted, but deep down she already knew the answer. For the first time in decades, she had a lead, and she wasn't going to ignore it. Laura clutched the photograph tightly in her hands as she sat on the bus, staring out the window. The streets blurred past, but her mind wasn't focused on the scenery. It was fixated on that one detail, the one she couldn't shake. Lillian Brooks. The principal had been there. She had stood right alongside the children and Mr. Gregory on the day they disappeared. Yet, for 27 years, her presence had been omitted from every report, every statement, every official version of the story. Why? Helen had tried to reason with her, had gently reminded her that they had been down this road before, chasing clues, clinging to fragments of hope, only to find themselves facing the same, unmovable wall of uncertainty. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was just another cruel coincidence. And yet, Laura couldn't let it go. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the photo as she exhaled sharply. The cemetery was only a few stops away. She had planned to go straight there, to place fresh flowers on Rory's grave, to honor her daughter's memory in the quiet way she always did. But something inside her shifted. As the bus slowed at a stop near an old, familiar neighborhood, her gaze snapped to the street ahead. And there it was, Lillian Brooks' house. Laura's pulse quickened. The modest two-story home looked almost exactly as she remembered it from years ago, neatly kept, with trimmed hedges and a small, pristine front porch. She hadn't been here in decades, not since the early days after the tragedy, when desperate parents had gathered outside, demanding answers from a woman who had none to give. A sudden impulse took hold of her. Without fully thinking it through, she pressed the bell and stood up. The driver barely glanced at her as she made her way off the bus, stepping onto the sidewalk. The doors hissed shut behind her, and in an instant, the bus pulled away, leaving her standing alone in front of the house. Now that she was here, she hesitated. What was she doing? Was she really about to march up to the door after all these years and demand answers? What if she was wrong? What if this was nothing more than her grief playing tricks on her again, stirring up ghosts she had spent years trying to make peace with? She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. But before she could decide whether to turn back or move forward, she heard the crunch of tires on pavement. A sleek, dark-colored car pulled into the driveway. Laura instinctively stepped back, watching as the driver's side door opened and a woman emerged. Her breath caught in her throat. Lillian Brooks. The former principal had aged, but Laura still recognized her instantly. The same sharp features, the same dark eyes, though now softened by time. Her hair, once a deep brown, was streaked with gray, tied back in a no-nonsense bun. But it wasn't just her. The passenger side door opened next, and a younger woman stepped out. Laura had never seen her before. Something about her presence immediately unsettled her. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, dressed in simple but elegant clothes. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, her dark eyes scanning the house as if she had been here before, but not often. Laura's heartbeat quickened. Who was she? Lillian turned to her companion, speaking in low tones, and the woman nodded before starting up the front steps. Laura didn't realize she had moved until she was suddenly closer, just within earshot. "Can I help you?" Lillian's voice rang out, sharp yet cautious, as she turned to face Laura fully. Her gaze flickered with recognition, but her posture stiffened. Laura swallowed hard, gripping the photo still tucked in her palm. "Mrs. Calloway," Lillian said, the name rolling off her tongue carefully, as though it carried weight. It's been a long time." "Yes," Laura said, her voice steady, but her mind reeling. "It has." The younger woman lingered at the doorway, glancing between them with quiet curiosity. Lillian cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. "What are you doing here?" Laura hesitated for only a second before answering. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. It wasn't entirely a lie. "I saw you and thought I should say hello." Lillian's lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could respond, the younger woman spoke. "Lillian, I'll go inside," she said softly, offering a polite but cautious smile to Laura before disappearing through the door. Laura's stomach twisted. Lillian. Not Mrs. Brooks. Not Principal Brooks. Just Lillian. The familiarity between them was clear. But Lillian Brooks had never had a daughter. Had she? The door clicked shut behind the woman, leaving Laura and Lillian alone in the fading afternoon light. Laura studied her face, searching for any sign of emotion. Guilt, surprise, fear. But Lillian's expression remained carefully controlled. "Mrs. Calloway," she said again, softer this time. "Why are you really here?" Laura's grip on the photograph tightened, and for the first time in 27 years, she had the distinct feeling that the truth was much closer than she had ever realized. The air between them felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Laura kept her eyes on Lillian Brooks, watching every flicker of emotion across the older woman's face. There was tension in the way she held herself, the slight tightness around her mouth, the way her hands gripped the strap of her purse a little too tightly. Lillian was uncomfortable, and Laura knew exactly why. For years, she had questioned everything about that trip, the way it was organized, the inconsistencies in the investigation, the lack of real answers. But never once had she thought to question who had actually been there that day. She had trusted the reports, trusted the statements, but now she wasn't so sure. She took a breath, trying to keep her voice even. "I saw a picture today," she said, holding Lillian's gaze. "A class photo, taken before the trip." Something flickered in the woman's eyes, so fast Laura almost missed it. "I remember all the school pictures we took," Lillian said smoothly. "It was standard for the time. This one was different," Laura pressed. "It was taken outside, in front of the yellow school bus. You were in it." Lillian blinked, just once, but her body tensed. I was?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. Laura studied her, refusing to let her off the hook. "Yes, which is strange, because I was told you weren't there that day." Lillian exhaled, shifting her weight slightly. "That must have been taken before the trip," she said, her tone clipped. "I often greeted the students before field trips. It was part of my job." Laura narrowed her eyes. "That's not what you just said. When I mentioned the picture, you sounded surprised, like you didn't know it existed." Lillian's fingers curled around the strap of her purse again. "It's been nearly 30 years, Mrs. Calloway," she said, her voice laced with forced patience. "Memories fade. I was not on that trip. That's what I told the police. That's what I've always said. And that is the truth. It was too fast, too defensive, and Laura wasn't buying it." She glanced at the house, at the door that had just shut behind the young woman, the stranger who had looked between them with quiet, knowing eyes. "Who was that?" she asked. Lillian's jaw tightened. "A friend. She called you by your first name." Lillian hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding. "We've known each other for years." Laura didn't believe her. She took a step closer. "Do you know who she reminded me of?" she asked softly. "Someone from that same class picture." Lillian's reaction was immediate. A sharp intake of breath. A flicker of panic. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, her voice suddenly sharper, more authoritative. "I don't know what you're trying to insinuate, but I have nothing more to say about that day. I've given my statements, I've told my truth. This," she gestured vaguely between them, "this is not something I want to revisit." Laura's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. She could feel the woman trying to shut her down, trying to make her doubt herself. But she wouldn't let that happen. She steadied her breath. "One last question," she said. "About Mr. Gregory." Something changed in Lillian's posture at the mention of the teacher's name. Laura caught it instantly, the stiffening of her shoulders, the way she suddenly wouldn't meet her gaze. She pressed forward. "You always defended him, didn't you?" Lillian's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Laura nodded slowly. "You never believed he was involved." Lillian exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't want to talk about this," But you know something, Laura pressed. Something about him. Something you never told us. I don't. Lillian stopped herself, her frustration slipping through. She clenched her jaw, then inhaled deeply before composing herself again. Mrs. Calloway, she said carefully, I have lived with the pain of that day just as you have. I have suffered through the accusations, the loss, the guilt of not being able to protect those children. Laura's breath caught at the word. Guilt. The way she said it, like it was more than just sorrow, like it was something she carried. The realization sent a chill through Laura's body. She took a slow step back, suddenly feeling like she was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something she wasn't fully prepared for. Lillian held her gaze, her eyes harder now, almost warning her. I would appreciate it, she said, her voice like steel. If you did not bring this up again. Laura stared at her, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. But as she made her way down the street, her mind was racing. Lillian Brooks knew something, and Laura wasn't about to let her keep it buried. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of silence that settled deep in the bones. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. Laura walked slowly along the familiar path, a bouquet of flowers clutched in her hands. Every year she came here on this day. Every year, she placed fresh blooms at Rory's headstone, whispering words into the air, hoping they would somehow reach her daughter. But this year felt different. She hadn't expected to spend the morning unraveling a mystery that had haunted her for nearly 3 decades. Hadn't expected to find a photograph that didn't add up. Hadn't expected to stand in front of Principal Brooks' house, searching for answers she still didn't have. As she reached Rory's grave, she knelt down, brushing away a few stray leaves that had gathered around the base of the headstone. The carved letters of her daughter's name were worn from time, the stone cold beneath her fingertips. I miss you, she whispered. I always will. She carefully arranged the flowers, smoothing out the ribbon she had tied around them earlier. But just as she was about to sit with her grief, to let it settle in as she did every year, something caught her eye. A figure stood in the distance, near the plot where the other missing children had their memorials. Laura felt her breath hitch. It was her, the young woman from Principal Brooks' house. She was standing motionless, her head bowed, hands clasped tightly around something. As Laura looked closer, she realized the woman was holding a small, framed photograph, its edges worn with age. A shiver ran down Laura's spine. Who was she mourning? She hesitated for only a moment before rising to her feet and walking toward her. The closer she got, the more she could see the woman's face. She wasn't just sad. She looked like someone carrying a lifetime of sorrow. Laura stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. Excuse me, she said softly. The woman tensed but didn't turn around. Laura took another step. I saw you earlier, she continued, at Lillian Brooks' house. The woman finally turned then, her dark eyes locking onto Laura's. Up close, she seemed even younger than Laura had first thought, mid-30s maybe. But there was something in her expression that made her seem older, as if time had weighed heavily on her. Laura glanced at the framed photograph, now pressed against the woman's chest. The image was faded, but she could still make out the face of a little girl. Laura's voice softened. Who are you grieving for? The woman swallowed hard. She didn't speak, but she gave a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that she had lost someone, too. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. They stood in shared silence, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. Then, barely above a whisper, the woman murmured, Rory was such an ass. Laura felt the world tilt. Her breath caught in her throat, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. The words had been spoken with affection, not malice, like someone reminiscing about an old friend, someone they had known well. Laura took a step forward, her voice barely steady. How do you know Rory? The woman's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't realized she had spoken aloud. She quickly looked away, gripping the frame even tighter. Laura's pulse quickened. She knew. This woman knew Rory. And in that moment, Laura understood something with terrifying certainty. This wasn't just another mourner, another grieving family member paying respects. This woman wasn't just visiting the cemetery. She was part of the story. Laura felt her entire body go still. The weight of the woman's words, spoken so casually, so familiar, sank deep into her bones. Rory was such an S. A sentence so small, so insignificant to an outsider, but to Laura it was everything. It was intimate. It was personal. It was real. She stared at the woman in front of her, her mind spinning, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't look away from the framed photograph pressed tightly against the stranger's chest. And then she saw it. The resemblance. It was subtle, aged by time, but now that Laura was looking for it, she couldn't unsee it. The contours of her face, the shape of her eyes, the way her lips pressed together in hesitation. It all mirrored the young girl in the faded photograph. Laura's pulse pounded in her ears. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. "How do you know my daughter?" The woman flinched, shifting uneasily, as if she hadn't realized what she had let slip. I don't," she stammered. I heard about her. That's all." It was a lie. A bad one. Laura's stomach twisted. She had spent 27 years looking for the truth, learning how to sift through people's empty condolences, the well-meaning words that never led anywhere. She knew when someone was hiding something. "Don't lie to me," Laura said, her voice eerily calm. "I've heard too many lies." The woman took a step back, her grip tightening around the framed photo. "I don't know what you want from me," she said quickly. I have to go." She turned as if to walk away, but Laura moved faster. She blocked her path, her hands shaking. She wasn't going to let her leave. Not until she got answers. "Who are you?" Laura demanded. "Who are you really?" The woman refused to meet her eyes. "Please, just let it go," she murmured. "It's better this way." Laura's breath hitched. She didn't know why, but she knew what she was about to ask before she even said it. The question burned on her tongue, clawed at her throat. It had haunted her for years. "Were you on that bus?" The woman froze. Laura's world seemed to shrink down to the space between them. The cemetery, the sky, the graves, all of it blurred into the background. The woman's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. For a moment, Laura thought she might deny it, might turn and run. But then, something in her broke. She exhaled a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping, as if she had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said it. "My name is Audrey Whitman." Laura's breath caught in her throat. Audrey. The name hit her like a lightning strike, jolting something deep inside her memory. Audrey Whitman. She had been one of the missing students, one of the children who had vanished that day. Laura felt her knees threaten to give out, her body trembling. "I was on that bus," Audrey said, her voice raw, filled with something Laura couldn't yet name. A pause, a breath, and then, "I survived." The world tilted beneath Laura's feet. The ground felt unsteady, the air too thin. A survivor, a survivor. For 27 years, she had lived with the same unshakable truth. No one came back. No one had ever been found. The children had vanished without a trace, leaving only questions, theories, and an unbearable emptiness. And yet, here she was, Audrey Whitman, one of them, one of Rory's classmates, alive, breathing, standing right in front of her. Laura opened her mouth, but no words came. She could barely process the storm of emotions crashing over her. Shock, disbelief, hope. "You..." Her voice barely came out, her throat tightening. "You survived." Audrey's eyes dropped to the ground. She gave the smallest of nods. Laura's breath hitched. "Then where have you been?" Audrey swallowed hard, gripping the framed photograph even tighter, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I was taken," she said, her voice hollow. "Like all of them." The past hung heavy in the air between them. Laura felt her stomach twist. "But you got away?" Another nod. 12 years ago. 12 years. That meant Audrey had been gone for 15 years before she escaped. Laura clenched her fists, trying to push away the rising wave of nausea. Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you tell anyone? Audrey squeezed her eyes shut, her face twisting with something close to guilt. I couldn't, she whispered. Laura shook her head. You couldn't? She repeated, her voice breaking. Why? Why didn't you tell your family? Tell us? We've been searching for decades. Audrey exhaled sharply, running a hand over her face. Because I was too broken, she admitted. I was too scared. And she hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. Because she told me not to. Laura stilled. A cold dread settled in her chest. Audrey hesitated again. And then, Lillian Brooks. The world stopped. Laura barely registered the gasp that escaped her own lips. It felt as though the entire world had just shifted, as if everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down. Principal Brooks? Laura choked out. Audrey gave a small, painful nod. She found me, helped me, gave me a new identity. She told me it was too late to come back, that I'd only be hurting the families if I did. Laura's body went rigid. Lillian Brooks had known. She had known for years, while Laura and Helen had spent night after night searching for their children, while parents had suffered through decades of not knowing, while police had declared the case cold. Lillian had been sitting on the truth. She knew at least one of the children had survived, and she had kept it a secret. Rage boiled in Laura's chest. That woman let us suffer, she hissed. She let us live in the dark. And you? She turned to Audrey, her voice trembling, pleading now. You let her? Tears welled in Audrey's eyes. I didn't know what to do, she admitted. I was barely holding myself together. She told me it was for the best. And I believed her. Laura shook her head furiously. The best? She repeated, her voice shaking with raw emotion. We have been in hell, Audrey, for 27 years. Do you know what it's like to wake up every morning and wonder if your child is still alive? To pray for an answer that never comes. Audrey flinched. I'm sorry, she whispered. I was scared. Laura felt her anger shift into something else, something more desperate. Then do something, she said, her voice quieter now but just as fierce. You can fix this, Audrey. You can tell the police everything. You can help us get answers. Audrey took a step back, shaking her head. I don't know if I can. Laura took a step forward. You can, she insisted. We are already in pain. You won't be hurting us. You'll be giving us the truth. Audrey's breathing was uneven, her hands trembling. Laura softened her tone. Please, she whispered. For Rory, for Sally, for all of them. A silence stretched between them, thick with tension, with a decision that could change everything. Audrey hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers shook as she pulled out her phone. Laura held her breath. Audrey stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she dialed. Laura could hear the distant ringing on the other end. And then, a voice. Audrey inhaled sharply, then spoke. I want to report a crime. Her voice trembled, but there was something stronger underneath it now. I was one of the missing children. Laura exhaled, a strange mix of relief and dread washing over her. Audrey closed her eyes, gripping the phone like a lifeline. I survived. The police station buzzed with restless energy. Officers moved quickly, their voices sharp, their expressions tense. The air felt charged, heavy with something unseen but deeply felt. The moment Audrey Whitman confirmed her identity, everything changed. Laura sat rigid in a plastic chair, her hands gripping the armrests as if she were bracing for impact. She had spent decades waiting for answers, praying for truth. Now it was unraveling before her, faster than she could comprehend. Across the room, Audrey sat hunched over, her fingers tightly intertwined, her knuckles white. She had told them everything. Her story, her survival, Lillian Brooks. And now, the weight of those words had set something into motion. An officer spoke hurriedly into his radio. "We need a unit dispatched immediately. Principal Lillian Brooks, former administrator of Millwood Elementary. Suspect in connection with a historic child trafficking case. Proceed with caution." The words made Laura's stomach churn. This was real. After all these years, after all the dead ends and unanswered prayers, the truth had finally come for Lillian Brooks. Laura felt Helen's hand slip into hers. She hadn't even realized her friend had arrived. But now, she squeezed Helen's fingers, gripping them like an anchor. Helen had always been the stronger one. But today they both felt small. The minutes stretched into hours. Then it happened. The precinct doors swung open with a violent clang, and they brought her in. Lillian Brooks, handcuffed, defeated. Her head was bowed slightly, but Laura could still see her face. The once proud principal reduced to a shell of the woman she had been all those years ago. Her clothes were neat but disheveled. Her hair still pinned back, but with strands falling loose around her face. She looked older, smaller, fragile in a way Laura had never seen before. But none of it mattered, because this woman who had once stood in front of a classroom full of children, promising their parents they were safe, had betrayed them all. She felt Laura's stare as she was led past, her eyes flickering upward for the briefest second. Their gazes locked, and in that instant, something unspoken passed between them. Laura expected denial, maybe even anger, but there was neither. Instead, there was guilt, and that was all she needed to see. The interrogation room door slammed shut behind Lillian. Then silence. Laura exhaled shakily, the storm inside her chest barely contained. Helen was still gripping her hand, and Audrey sat motionless, her face unreadable. It felt like hours before a detective finally stepped into the waiting area. His expression was grave. "She's talking," he said. The entire room stilled. Laura swallowed hard. What is she saying?" The detective hesitated, then motioned for them to sit. "This is going to be hard to hear," he warned. "But you deserve to know." Laura nodded numbly. Helen let out a quiet breath, steadying herself. And then the truth came spilling out. Lillian Brooks had been deeply in debt. Not just to banks or credit companies, but to dangerous people. People who didn't forgive. And they had given her a way out. A deal. The school trip had been a setup. A carefully orchestrated handoff arranged with traffickers. The children had never been meant to return. Laura felt nausea rise in her throat as the detective continued. "The bus driver wasn't part of it," he said grimly. "He was just doing his job. He was murdered before they crossed the state line." Helen let out a strangled gasp. Laura couldn't breathe. "The children and Mr. Gregory were taken across the border," the detective continued. "Once they were in Mexico, they were divided." He exhaled slowly, like he was bracing himself for the next words. "The boys were sold into forced labor overseas. The girls," he hesitated, his jaw tightening. "They were trafficked." The walls felt like they were closing in. Laura could barely register the words. 27 years. 27 years of hoping, searching, dreaming that maybe, somehow, Rory was still out there. That maybe she had escaped, that she had found a way to survive. But the truth was so much worse than anything she had imagined. Her daughter had been stolen. Not by chance. Not by accident. But by design. Lillian Brooks had sold them out. And no one had known. Laura's hands shook violently. Helen had turned away, silent tears streaming down her face. But Audrey already knew. She had lived it. And yet, for all her suffering, she had survived. Laura turned to her, her voice breaking. Did any of them make it?" Audrey's face was pale, her fingers gripping the armrests of her chair. She shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know where the others were taken. But I know about Rory." Laura's chest tightened. Audrey's face crumpled. "She didn't make it," she whispered. She died that first night." Laura felt the world shatter around her. Helen sobbed. Audrey's voice cracked. "They gave her something to keep her quiet. It was too much. I don't think she even knew what was happening." Laura clutched her stomach, bending forward as if she had been physically struck. For years, she had prayed for an answer, and now she had one. But it was one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Laura felt her entire world tilt beneath her. The detective's voice became distant, muffled, like she was underwater. The room around her blurred, faces indistinct. The only thing she could focus on was Audrey. The young woman sat stiffly, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Laura knew before she even said it. Still, she needed to hear it. What about Rory? Her voice barely rose above a whisper, fragile, shaking. Audrey's eyes flickered toward her, wide and filled with a sorrow Laura had never seen before. It was that look, the unbearable guilt, the weight of unspeakable truth, that told Laura the answer before Audrey spoke it aloud. A long pause, a breath that shuddered. Then, finally, the words that broke everything. She didn't make it. The air left Laura's lungs all at once. Her body froze, but inside, she was screaming. She didn't make it. No, couldn't be. There had always been a chance. That's what had kept her going all these years. The hope that maybe, somehow, her daughter was still out there. That maybe she had survived just as Audrey had. That maybe Rory had escaped and had been waiting, just waiting to be found. But now that hope was gone. What happened to her? The words barely formed. Audrey swallowed hard. She looked sick, pale, like she might collapse under the weight of her own memories. That first night, they gave us something, some kind of injection, to keep us quiet, to make sure we didn't fight back. Laura's chest tightened. Audrey inhaled sharply. It was too much for Rory, she whispered. She never woke up. Laura staggered. The words struck her like a knife, twisting deep into the hollow space in her chest where her daughter should have been. No body. No godbis. Just gone. The traffickers had stolen her, and then, just like that, they had taken her life, too. Helen let out a strangled sob beside her, her hands covering her mouth. Her entire body shook, already sensing what was coming next. Sally? Helen choked out, the question barely a breath. Audrey's gaze dropped to the floor. They messed up her dosage, she admitted, her voice cracking. She didn't make it either. Helen's cry tore through the room, raw and broken. A sound of absolute devastation. Laura felt herself fold inward, her arms wrapping around herself as if she could physically hold her grief together. This was it. After 27 years, the mystery had an answer. The answer she had begged for, prayed for, pleaded with God to give her. And yet, it was the one she never wanted to hear. Her little girl was never coming home. There would be no reunion, no miracles, no long-lost embrace. Just a cold, empty headstone in a cemetery. Just a mother, grieving a child who had been taken from her twice, once in life and now in truth. She let out a quiet, broken sound, something between a sob and a breath. Helen reached for her, and together, they wept. The kind of grief that never truly leaves. The weight of the truth still pressed down on Laura's chest. But for the first time in 27 years, she wasn't drowning in uncertainty. She knew. The answers were brutal, heartbreaking, but they were finally real. And now justice was coming. Outside the police station, the night had settled in. The air was cool, crisp, almost clean, as if the world itself had shifted in response to what had just unfolded. But inside, the station was still alive with movement. Officers worked at their desks, detectives whispered in urgent voices, and behind closed doors, Lillian Brooks was being processed for formal charges. Laura had watched her being led away, still handcuffed, her face drawn and hollow. There had been no outbursts, no desperate denials, no fight, just resignation. Lillian Brooks had spent 27 years burying the truth. Now she had to face it. The case had officially been reopened, launching an international investigation. The police were already coordinating with agencies across the border, determined to track down the remaining traffickers, to find what remained of the missing children, even if it was just to bring closure to their families. And Audrey, the lone survivor, was at the center of it all. Laura turned to her, watching as she sat stiffly in one of the precinct's chairs. Exhaustion etched into every part of her. She had done the hardest thing imaginable. Spoken the truth she had been too afraid to say for years. And now she was in danger. Witness protection had already been arranged. The police weren't taking any chances. If Lillian had stayed quiet all these years, it wasn't just out of guilt. There were powerful people who had wanted this story to stay buried. Now that the truth was out, Audrey was a target. Laura knew she had to leave soon. New name, new location, a new life where no one could find her. But before she did, Laura needed to say something. She stepped forward, reaching out and gently taking Audrey's hands in her own. Audrey blinked up at her, surprised. Laura swallowed back the tears threatening to spill over again. She had already cried so much tonight. But this moment, it wasn't about grief. It was about something else. "You did the right thing," Laura said, her voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, you gave us the truth." A tear slipped down Audrey's cheek, but she said nothing, just gripped Laura's hands a little tighter. Laura took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Now," she continued, her voice soft but strong, "let's make sure no one ever forgets what happened, because that was the only way to honor Rory, Sally, and every child who had been stolen that day. Not by burying the past, not by letting it fade into another cold case, another tragedy people spoke about in hushed voices, but by facing it, by telling their stories, by making sure the world never forgot." Audrey gave a shaky nod, and Laura squeezed her hands one last time before letting go. Helen stood beside her, silent but present, her own grief a mirror of Laura's. They had both lost their daughters that day, and now they had finally found the truth together. As they walked out of the station, the first stars had begun to appear in the dark sky above them. Laura looked up, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The grief was still there, it would always be there. But now it was no longer weighed down by the unknown. She had spent 27 years searching for answers. Now she could finally rest. As Laura stepped out of the police station, the night air met her with a quiet, almost gentle embrace. It was cool and crisp, the kind of evening that whispered of endings and new beginnings all at once. The station doors closed behind her with a muted thud, a final punctuation to the chapter that had haunted her for nearly 3 decades. She stood there for a moment, breathing in deeply. For so many years, she had walked around with a hollow space inside her, a wound that refused to close. Every anniversary of Rory's disappearance had felt like reliving it all over again. The questions, the unanswered prayers, the cruel silence. But tonight was different. The grief was still there, pressing against her ribs like an old, familiar ache. It always would be. Losing a child was not something a mother ever recovered from. But for the first time in 27 years, she wasn't lost in the unknown. She knew. Rory's story had an ending now. A painful, cruel one, but an ending nonetheless. And in its place, something new settled in her chest. Purpose. She had spent nearly 3 decades searching for the truth. Now, she would spend the rest of her life making sure no one ever forgot it. The children who had vanished that day weren't just names on an old missing persons case. They weren't just unsolved mysteries or tragic statistics. They were real. They had been loved, and they deserved justice. Laura turned her gaze upward, the sky stretching above her, dark and endless. The stars had begun to appear, blinking softly in the vast expanse of black. She thought of Rory, her little girl, with her wild spirit and contagious laughter. Her child who had gone on a school trip and never come home. Somewhere out there, in ways Laura would never fully understand, Rory was finally at peace. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, so was she. For nearly 3 decades, the truth had been buried beneath lies, silence, and fear. Families had been left in the dark, searching for answers that seemed destined to remain lost. 15 children had vanished without a trace, swallowed by a darkness so vast that hope itself had nearly disappeared. But Laura Calloway never gave up. Through years of grief, unanswered prayers, and relentless doubt, She had clung to a single unwavering belief that the truth was still out there, that somewhere, buried beneath the cold case files, the rumors, and the pain, there was an answer. And in the end, she found it. The cost of the truth was devastating. Betrayal, murder, a school trip turned into a carefully orchestrated crime. The unimaginable horrors the missing children endured were too cruel to comprehend, their fate sealed by greed and desperation. But even in the darkness, there was light. Audrey Whitman, the girl who survived, was the key to unraveling the decades-old mystery. Her story, buried in guilt and silence, became the spark that reignited the investigation. And with her testimony, justice finally took shape. Lillian Brooks, the woman who had built a life on deception, who had let families grieve for years while hiding the truth, was finally held accountable. The police, now armed with new evidence, launched an international investigation, determined to find what remained of the missing children and dismantle the network responsible. And Laura, a mother who had spent years chasing shadows, could finally rest knowing that Rory's story would not be forgotten. This was more than just a tragedy. It was a story of loss, deception, and perseverance, a testament to a mother's unbreakable love, a reminder that, even in the darkest of places, the truth cannot stay hidden forever. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, and sometimes, even after decades of silence, justice will find a way. If the story gripped you as much as it did us, then you won't want to miss what's coming next. There's more to uncover, more secrets to be revealed, and justice is only just beginning. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2, where we dive even deeper into the case, the shocking new developments, and the consequences that follow. If you found this story as chilling and important as we did, hit the like button and share it with others, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The truth is out, but the journey isn't over yet. Stay tuned. Part 2 is coming soon.